"Pay for this wedding or get out of here now," my son shouted in front of hundreds of guests, and in that instant the entire hall seemed to freeze around me. I stood there in an old worn suit, still recovering from a minor surgery that left my hands trembling, trying to understand how a father who had given everything could suddenly be treated like a stranger at his own child's wedding. The chandeliers above me sparkled like nothing was wrong. The music kept playing as if the world had not just cracked open beneath my feet. I felt a shove, sudden and humiliating, enough to break my balance and send me stumbling toward a banquet table filled with silent witnesses holding up their phones instead of their voices. No one moved to help, no one called my name, and in that hollow silence, I realized I was no longer a father in their eyes, only an inconvenience interrupting a perfect celebration. My son adjusted his tie calmly, as if I were nothing more than a minor disruption to be removed, and that cold indifference cut deeper than the physical push. I searched his face for hesitation, for recognition, for even a flicker of memory of everything I had sacrificed, but there was nothing there except impatience and judgment. The laughter around me grew louder, feeding on my humiliation, turning my pain into entertainment for people who did not know my story. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat as I understood something terrifying. This was not a sudden conflict. It was the final exposure of a distance that had been growing for years without me noticing. I had given him my savings, my strength, my youth, built through long nights of labor, believing love could never be measured in transactions. Yet here I was, being priced like a burden that needed to be removed. My wife reached for me, but she was stopped, and in that moment, I felt the ground beneath my life shift permanently. I did not shout, I did not resist, because I finally understood that pleading would not restore what had already been broken long before this night. I straightened myself slowly, not because I was strong, but because I refused to collapse in front of those who had already decided my worth. And as I stood there surrounded by strangers who once called themselves family, I realized the most painful truth of all. I had not been pushed out of a wedding. I had been pushed out of a life I thought I belonged to. Finally, the room no longer felt like a celebration, but like a courtroom silent. 6 months before that wedding night, I had believed I was doing the right thing as a father when Logan called me with a voice that sounded tired, but full of promise. He told me life in Charleston was finally moving forward, that Skylar's ambitions required a better environment, and that Isabella and I deserved safer living conditions closer to modern hospitals and opportunities. He spoke with such calm certainty that I forgot to question what I was really being asked to give up. That evening, I sat in my small home, the same place I had built slowly over decades of labor, every wall carrying the marks of my hands, and every corner holding memories I never thought I would abandon. When Logan said there was a way to simplify everything, that moving in with them would solve distance and care issues, I listened like a father who still believed trust was unbreakable. A few days later, he sent a folder thick with documents, explaining it was only a legal arrangement to secure our residence rights in his new penthouse, nothing more than a formality to avoid complications. I remember reading each line slowly, struggling with the dense legal language, while he stood nearby reassuring me that everything was safe and temporary. Skylar brought tea, smiling softly, creating an atmosphere of comfort that made doubt feel unnecessary, and in that carefully constructed moment of warmth, my caution dissolved. I signed the papers believing I was protecting my family's future, not realizing I was surrendering the foundation of my own past. Only later did I understand the truth hidden inside those pages, that what I had signed was not protection but transfer, not residence rights but ownership itself. My home, the place where I had raised my son and buried my memories, was no longer mine, and I had walked into that loss with my eyes open but my understanding blind. In the weeks after we moved into the penthouse, I began to notice changes so subtle at first that I convinced myself I was imagining them. The space that Logan once called ours slowly stopped feeling like a place I belonged to. The bedroom we were promised was quietly reassigned, then reduced to a storage room filled with unopened boxes, and Isabella and I were guided toward a small corner behind the kitchen, as if we were temporary guests who had overstayed their welcome. Skylar's tone remained polite, even warm in front of others, but when no one was listening, her words became sharper, more controlled, as though every action of ours needed permission. Logan, once attentive and patient, grew distant, always busy, always on calls, always stepping away just before any conversation could become meaningful. I told myself it was the pressure of work, the stress of building a future, but deep down something inside me began to fracture quietly. The worst shift did not come through words but through silence, the kind that replaces acknowledgement with invisibility. When visitors arrived, we were no longer introduced, no longer included, and sometimes gently instructed to remain out of sight because, as Skylar put it, our presence did not match the image they were trying to build. I remember standing in the kitchen one afternoon, hearing laughter from the living room, realizing I had become invisible inside a home that legally no longer belonged to me but emotionally still carried my memories. Isabella tried to stay positive, insisting that families go through adjustments, that love would correct what distance was causing, but I could see the exhaustion in her eyes growing day by day. Then came the moment that changed everything, when I accidentally saw Logan's laptop open on a fundraising page using Isabella's photo, presenting her illness as a public appeal without her consent, turning her suffering into a carefully constructed story designed to attract sympathy and money. In that instant, something inside me stopped defending what I was seeing, because I finally understood this was no longer misunderstanding or stress, but calculation. And for the first time, I began to see that the son I raised was no longer simply lost. He was building a life where we were no longer part of the equation. The breaking point did not arrive with shouting or confrontation, but with a quiet realization that we had become invisible inside a life we once believed was shared. After discovering the fundraising page, I began to notice everything with different eyes, as if a veil had been lifted that I could never place back again. Every gesture in the penthouse now carried a hidden distance, every smile felt like a performance, and every instruction directed toward Isabella and me sounded less like family guidance and more like controlled placement within someone else's carefully managed image. We were no longer living with Logan and Skylar. We were being positioned, moved, and hidden depending on who was present and what story needed to be shown. When their friends visited, I remember Skylar gently but firmly asking us to stay in the bedroom area, explaining that it was better for everyone's comfort. Yet the words carried an edge that left no room for refusal. I stood in silence as strangers laughed in the living room, their voices echoing through a space I had once believed would be my final home, and I realized I had been reduced to something unacknowledged, something inconvenient to the narrative they wanted to display. Logan rarely met my eyes anymore, and when he did, there was a brief flicker of discomfort, as if acknowledging me required effort he no longer wished to spend. Isabella, despite her weakening health, still tried to maintain dignity, adjusting her posture, speaking softly, refusing to complain, but I could feel her slowly shrinking under the weight of being unseen. One evening, while carrying medicine to her, I overheard Skylar reminding Logan that our presence needed to remain discreet because it did not align with the lifestyle they were presenting to investors and guests. That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else because it confirmed what I had been trying to deny. We were no longer part of their life, only an obstacle to their appearance. And in that silent realization, standing in the shadowed corner of a luxury home that no longer felt like home at all, I understood that respect had already left long before we were ever asked to leave. The final thread that tied us to that penthouse snapped not with a warning, but with a silence so complete it felt intentional. One morning, everything we owned was already outside the door. Our belongings were lined neatly in the hallway, as if we were deliveries waiting to be collected, not people who had once been invited into a family. There was no explanation, no confrontation, no farewell, only the cold finality of a decision made without our presence. I stood there for a moment staring at the boxes, trying to convince myself this must be a misunderstanding, some temporary arrangement that would be clarified once Logan appeared. But the longer I waited, the clearer the truth became. Isabella sat slowly on the floor beside our things, her breath uneven, her hand trembling as she tried to hold on to the edge of reality that was slipping away faster than she could process. I called Logan first. No answer. Then again, silence. Skylar's phone went straight to voicemail, as if both of them had stepped out of reach at the exact same time by design, not coincidence. The hallway felt longer than it had ever felt before, stretching into a void that swallowed every memory we had built in that place. I remember looking at Isabella and realizing I had no words left that could protect her from what was happening. For the first time in my life, I did not know where to take my wife, not because I lacked direction, but because every direction I had once trusted had been taken away without warning. The penthouse door behind us remained closed, unchanged, indifferent, as if nothing significant had occurred inside it. There was no anger yet, only a heavy disbelief pressing down on my chest, the kind that numbs instead of breaks. And as we stood there surrounded by our own discarded lives, I understood something I had refused to accept until that moment. We were not being asked to leave. We were being erased. That was when Caleb appeared, not like someone entering a story, but like someone who had been quietly observing it from the edge long before we realized we needed help. I had seen him before in passing near the small bakery, where I often bought bread in the mornings, a man who never spoke more than necessary, always carrying a calm that felt unusual in a world that rarely offered it. When he saw Isabella sitting on the ground that day, he did not ask what had happened, and he did not demand explanations. He simply said, "Come with me," in a tone that made refusal feel unnecessary. We followed him because we had nothing left to lose, and because sometimes exhaustion makes trust easier than doubt. He brought us to a small room behind an old church, modest and quiet, far removed from the polished world we had just been pushed out of. And for the first time in days, Isabella was given warmth instead of judgment, water instead of silence, care instead of control. Caleb moved with quiet precision, checking her condition, asking simple questions that carried the weight of experience, and I began to notice that he understood more than he was saying. When I finally asked who he was, he only mentioned that he had once worked in legal fields, a past he did not elaborate on, as if it belonged to someone he no longer intended to be. The next morning, after I explained everything that had happened, he asked to see the documents I had signed, and the way he read them changed the air in the room. There was no shock in his expression, only recognition, the kind that comes from having seen similar patterns too many times before. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and certain. They had gone too far, and worse, they had left traces that could not be easily hidden. For the first time since everything began collapsing, I felt something other than confusion or helplessness. I felt clarity forming through the fog, as if the truth, however painful, was finally becoming structured enough to stand on. Caleb did not react like someone discovering a scandal. He reacted like someone confirming a pattern he had seen before. Over the next hours, he went through every document I had signed, every paper Logan had handed me, and every vague agreement I had trusted without understanding the consequences. The more he read, the quieter the room became, as if even the air was waiting for his conclusion. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm, and that calmness made his words even heavier. There were irregularities everywhere, he said, not just mistakes but intentional structures designed to shift ownership, redirect responsibility, and conceal financial movement behind layers of legal language. I sat still as he explained how signatures could be replicated or misrepresented, how medical assistance claims could be fabricated to trigger sympathy-based funding, and how certain transfers were never meant to benefit Isabella at all. Each sentence felt like a piece of a world I thought I understood collapsing into something unrecognizable. At one point, he placed a printed page in front of me, showing transactions tied to the so-called fundraising effort, and I realized the money I believed was meant for care had been circulating through accounts that had nothing to do with medicine or treatment. It was not chaos, it was structure, carefully built and quietly maintained. Skylar's involvement, Caleb suggested, was not accidental either, but aligned with image management and external perception, shaping narratives that attracted trust from outsiders while hiding the reality inside. "Logan," he said carefully, was not just making poor decisions, he was following a system that rewarded deception as long as it remained undiscovered. I felt no immediate anger, only a deep, hollow understanding that the life I thought was breaking apart suddenly had a shape, and that shape was deliberate. For the first time, I was not asking what went wrong. I was beginning to understand how long it had been going wrong, without me seeing it. After the truth was laid out in front of me, something shifted inside me that I did not expect. It was not rage or despair, but a cold, steady awareness that I could no longer afford to remain silent. Caleb did not push me toward revenge or confrontation. Instead, he spoke about patience, structure, and timing, the kind of language used when a situation must be handled carefully rather than emotionally. I began to see that reacting impulsively would change nothing, but understanding everything would change everything. In the days that followed, I stayed in the small room behind the church with Isabella, watching her rest, while Caleb quietly organized what he called a map of truth, gathering every document, every transaction trail, every inconsistency that could be verified. I did not fully understand the legal terminology, but I understood the direction we were moving in. Nothing would be hidden forever, not when the evidence was connected correctly. Caleb made it clear that Logan's strength came from perception, not stability, and that perception could be dismantled without a single shout if the right facts were placed in the right order at the right time. For the first time in my life, I was not acting as a father trying to fix a son, but as someone preparing to face a reality that had already chosen its path. At night, I would sit alone outside the church room, thinking not about revenge, but about responsibility, how long I had ignored signs, how easily trust had replaced judgment, and how silence had allowed everything to grow unchecked. Caleb handled communication carefully, reaching out to relevant parties without exposing our position, ensuring that nothing could be traced back to emotion or impulse. I learned to wait, not because I was powerless, but because timing had become the only form of control I still had. And as each day passed, I realized that this was no longer about a broken relationship. It was about revealing a structure that had been carefully built on assumptions I had once accepted without question. The day of the presentation arrived with an atmosphere of polished confidence, the kind of event where every detail is designed to impress before a single truth is spoken. I entered quietly, taking a seat at the very back of the hall where no one would notice me, not because I wanted to hide, but because I needed to observe without disturbing the illusion Logan had carefully built. On stage, he stood with a confidence that once would have made me proud, speaking fluently about vision, growth, and opportunity, his words rehearsed into perfection. Skylar sat in the front row, composed and attentive, projecting the image of success that they had both constructed so carefully for the world to see. For a brief moment, I almost felt like I was watching someone else's life, someone distant, because the son I once knew no longer seemed to exist in the space between those polished sentences. Then Caleb stood up. He did not interrupt with force or drama. He simply requested verification of certain structural and financial details related to ownership and funding sources, his tone calm enough that it did not immediately disturb the audience. Logan smiled at first, assuming it was a technical clarification that could be brushed aside, but that smile began to fade the moment Caleb projected the first document onto the screen. The room shifted subtly as familiar terms were replaced with real evidence, and I saw Logan's posture tighten as recognition replaced confidence. Old designs, timestamps, ownership records, and financial pathways appeared one after another, each one connecting pieces that could no longer be separated by explanation. When Isabella's image appeared tied to fundraising materials, the silence in the room deepened, not because people understood everything at once, but because they understood enough to begin questioning. Logan tried to regain control with words, but his voice no longer carried the certainty it had minutes before. Skylar's composure cracked, her attention shifting rapidly, as if searching for an exit from a narrative that was no longer responding to her direction. I stood up slowly, not to confront, but to witness the final collapse of something that had been built on assumptions rather than truth. And when I spoke, I did not raise my voice. I simply stated that I was not there to take anything back, but to close what had been opened incorrectly, and in that moment, the story they controlled no longer belonged to them. After I left the hall, there was no sense of triumph following me, only a deep stillness, as if a long storm had finally exhausted itself. The air outside felt different, lighter in a way I could not immediately trust, and I found myself walking without urgency, as though my body had forgotten what it meant to run toward conflict. Isabella was waiting when I returned, sitting quietly in the small room behind the church, her presence steady in a way the world outside had never been. She looked at me and did not ask for details, only one simple question, as if she already understood the direction everything had taken. I told her it was finished, not because everything in life had been repaired, but because the cycle that had held us captive had finally been broken. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and in that silence, I realized how different it felt compared to all the silences that had come before it. There was no fear in it anymore, no waiting for the next blow, only the quiet acceptance of what could no longer be changed. In the days that followed, life did not suddenly become easy, but it became honest. There were no more performances to maintain, no more roles to play in someone else's story. Caleb eventually prepared to leave, telling me that truth had already done its work, and that what remained was rebuilding, not chasing what had already collapsed. I understood then that justice was never about destruction, but about restoring balance where distortion had taken over. I did not feel like a man who had won something. I felt like someone who had finally set something down after carrying it too long. We stayed in the simplest rhythm imaginable, waking with the sun, caring for each other without conditions, speaking only when words were necessary. And in that quiet existence, I began to see clearly what I had missed for so many years. That family is not measured by sacrifice alone, but by respect, honesty, and the ability to recognize when love has been replaced by harm. When I looked at Isabella by the window, calm and breathing without fear, I knew I had not returned to the past, nor erased it, but finally stepped out of its shadow.